Hi there, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the soundbites. My guest in studio today is Peter Tucker, who's the Director, Advocacy and Public Policy for the Vermont Association of Realtors. Welcome.
Great. Thanks, Pat, for having me.
Well, I'm glad you were able to come today because we have two awesome bills, I guess, that have just been passed out of the House and Senate, and it's all about housing. Mm-hmm. And Peter is our go-to guy on housing. You've been on the show a couple of times.
I have.
Mm-hmm. And it's been very well received. And we've got two bills, H.479, which is the House bill, and then S.127, which is the Senate bill. And there's a couple of other housing bills sort of floating around, emergency housing and some other stuff, I think. But these are the two main bills that are going to fix housing in Vermont. Or so they say.
Right. Well, so, and I think that both of these bills have a lot in common. Yeah. Many times the House does one thing, the Senate does another, and then they try to figure out how to, who's going to carry the day. But probably 50 to 60% of these bills are actually identical language. The housing discussion really starts with the administration. And the governor in this year's budget put in around $45 million for different housing initiatives. And those are reflected in both bills, although the dollars may have changed by the committees as they started to examine it. So really at the top end of both bills, there are three programs that are really important to housing. The first one's called VHIP, Vermont Home Investment Program. Mm-hmm. And VHIP is a program that the Agency of Housing and Community Development runs. It allows for grants of up to $50,000 to rehab, the easiest way I can describe it, non-code compliant rental properties. In other words, something that can't be rented because it's not up to code.
Right.
And the grants allow that to happen. Agency of Housing Community Development has been very happy with the outcome. They feel like they've gotten a lot of units over the past couple of years. So this isn't a new program, but one rather that needs continual funding.
Great.
And so we've had some discussions with the Agency of Housing Community Development about offering or extending this program to potential home ownership. And as the representative of the Vermont Association of Realtors, our goal is to help folks get into homes, to own homes. So this hasn't happened yet, but what we run into, especially for that first-time home buyer, are properties that are somewhat in disrepair. And many times the bank is not willing to loan on them because the quality of the property is low. So if we could find a way to bridge the gap for this first-time home buyer to put a new roof on, to put a furnace in, something of that nature, major obviously, but give the bank the confidence that the property will be in good condition when they loan on it, this would allow for more home ownership opportunities. Right now, VHIP limited to rental housing, and it's been doing a really good job. And the governor wants to fund it. He had $15 million in his budget for VHIP. We'll see where that all ends up at the end of the budget discussion, which is ongoing as well. The second program is for mobile home improvements and repairs. Many mobile home parks sit in low-lying areas and were flooded or really challenged by flooding. What this program would do is allow mobile home folks to put in foundations, do water improvements, things that are important for that quality of life. And then the third program that the governor proposed is to provide funding to the Vermont Bond Bank for infrastructure development. Great. And we're going to talk a bit today about infrastructure development. One of the things that we realize when we look at residential housing development is the cost to put in water, sewer, roads, sidewalks, things that are critical to actually make the development occur. And they're expensive. And 30 years ago, municipal works projects kind of did that for developers, and
Right.
all they had to do was hook up. In this day and age, it really does fall on the development itself to make sure that that can happen. So the bond bank would provide funding for things like water and sewer lines.
That's great.
Yeah.
I know you and I talked about it one time when you see the big old schools and why can't they be turned into apartments? But that's a big expense because everybody wants their own bathroom facilities
Yeah.
and stuff, and that's a lot harder than it appears.
Commercial conversion, is really challenging. And, we look at the change in the way folks are using office space right now, at bricks and mortar retail, things like that.
Right.
And, to reconfigure those into residential housing is very expensive, and not always easy. We have dorms here at the old Vermont College.
Right.
But to convert those into residential housing, is really a big challenge, and
Yeah.
just it's going to take some kind of public subsidy to accomplish that. And I think our focus is in other areas right now.
Yeah, because I think like myself and other people just it's there, it's empty, reconvert it. But then when you start talking about what has to happen,
Right.
do they ever talk about tiny homes? I'm very big on tiny homes. I could live in one of them. I love them. Do they talk about that? That seems to be a good solution.
Yeah, I guess that discussion is manufactured homes. Are they built in a factory? Mobile, modular homes or mobile homes that are more the kind of trailers that we've always imagined, but much more modern now, much more efficient. So those kind of programmings are going on, I guess, and
good.
maybe tiny homes would be part of that.
Yeah, because I would think the prefab homes are really solidly made because they're in a vacuumed area. I mean, they're not in the weather,
Sure. Yeah.
and you pick them up and don't quite just move them, but
Right.
pretty close.
But you kind of bolt them together when you get them on the site. They come in several pieces.
Yeah.
And that is, one of the studies in the housing bill was about, these manufactured homes.
Right.
And, that was a smaller allocation just to get the study done. But I'm not sure that's going to survive the budget process.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so, with all of these things, great programs that the policy committees have put together, they still have to go to the Appropriations Committee, who is charged with managing the budget of the state of Vermont, right?
So is that, you've got this House bill, the Senate bill, is that a committee of conference? And what happens now to these two bills? I mean,
Sure.
they're going to have, you're right, I looked at each of the headings in each bill, and they're pretty similar.
Yeah.
You and I talked about one major difference that I'd like to talk about in both bills, but pretty much it's the same. So what happens? How do they get a bill out?
Yeah, very often, right, the House works on the Senate bill and vice versa, and then they would either agree or come to a committee of conference at the end of the session.
Right.
The reality now is, I think that the chair of House General and Housing, Representative Mahaley, and the chair of Senate Economic Development and Housing, Senator Allison Clarkson, they're having, as Representative Mahaley said, I meet with her every Thursday and have a discussion. Most of the language is common, and most of the other things that are in the House bill or the Senate bill are really distinct. They're offered in one, not the other. So I think they will kind of pick and choose, the components that they want to continue with. As you mentioned, I think the biggest difference between the two bills is in the Senate bill S.127, a program called CHIP.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that because that sounds interesting.
Yeah. So remember that up on the front end of the bill there is an allocation to the Vermont Bond Bank to help with infrastructure development. Well, a lot of times that funding is not going to be enough to just do the infrastructure, but it's a good basis to start with. They can offer it at a lower interest rate, and it allows a municipality or whoever is going to do this program to kind of stack up their financing. They may get a low rate for a certain chunk of it, and then have to go to the market for other parts. But CHIP is easiest way for me to refer to it is a project-based tax incremental financing district. Right. And we've had some experience in the past with tax incremental financing. St. Albans, I think, is a really good example of a city that took advantage of it, kind of redid their Main Street, and now they see residential development going on. Big cities can do that. They have the planners and the ability to take on those kinds of projects. And tax incremental financing in its simplest form is a mechanism that allows a municipality to go out and get a bond for infrastructure development. Right. Water and sewer are the most common ones. Now that bond needs to be paid back over the next 20 years or so. What they do is by using TIF funding, they're able to not, let's see, to use education funds to pay the bond, make the bond payments. Right. And say, well, gee, this is taking away from the education fund. Well, the goal here is in a relatively short period of time for the development that has occurred as a result of that municipal infrastructure to increase the value of the grand list, right. And in many cases to increase it dramatically, so that the municipality can pay the bond back with some of the increase in the grand list, and the balance of that goes right back to the ed fund as more revenue for the state.
And this program, they talked about having smaller TIFs. Right. Years ago, because we had talking about TIF in Berlin to do our downtown.
Sure.
But the object was smaller towns don't, as you just mentioned it perfectly, smaller towns don't have the expertise of staff to do the stuff that the TIF requires. So this will allow smaller towns to do a very similar thing that the Burlingtons and St. Johnsbury does, right?
Exactly, yeah. Great. And a project-based, so the concept here is it's a project-based TIF. So, with St. Albans, they built their downtown and they just waited for development to occur. Not exactly, but they thought that this would allow for more development to occur, and it has over time. A project-based TIF would be tied to one project. Probably one of the better examples is going to occur in Middlebury, where there's I think it's like 230 unit development. Wow. Different things: townhouses, apartments, and then homes for sale. This would have allowed, they had to go for a general TIF, but this would allow a smaller community to say, hey, I've got a project, a subdivision here for residential housing, and if we do this tax incremental financing for just to get the water and sewer lines out to this particular project, then it can continue. And so, yes, smaller towns will be able to take advantage of it. I think, because you're not just hoping that development will occur, this is tied directly to a development. And as a result, I think the payback will be faster and really a lot easier to track, right?
Well, because what's all the taxes that you collect within that TIF district don't go to the town. They go back, they get reinvested back into the district, right, to make it be finished faster and be part of the tax rolls. Right.
What your goal is to expand the grant list. Right. And with a project-based TIF, I think, you can pretty much pencil it out right from the get-go. You know what your infrastructure is going to cost. You know what the development is going to produce in grand list value. And hopefully, it concludes in a not too distant future.
I was glad to read that, because I remember years ago this was a big issue, making smaller, having towns be able to do the smaller TIFs. Now, this was in the Senate bill, and
That's
you
correct.
mentioned in the House bill the thing that stuck out in that bill was the housing appeal process, which is Section 8, and you wanted to talk about that, which So Act 250 in there somewhere? It must be.
Well, this is for appeals of mostly of town permits. Act 250, the appeal process. I'd love to talk about that in a minute because we're going to be very involved in it. But Representative Mahaley, he is the former dean of Vermont Law School. Is a legal mind.
I knew that name.
And he really feels like we've got to find a way for good projects that are ready to go forward, to only be appealed if they really are causing damage, basically. What he did, and we used to have, or we currently have, because we haven't changed the law yet, it required 20 people, and a butter always can appeal, right? Like they're right next door to a project and they have a right to have their say. But, many times, a couple of people would get together and say, hey, we don't really like the way this aesthetically looks, or, something maybe on the other side of town, and, would be able to create an appeal. So last year, we actually put in that it needed to be 20 people in a town. So at least had a, bigger pool of folks that all had the same basic disagreement with the proposed development. What he has done is he's pulled out the 20 people, and at first I was aghast. I'm like, wow, we're going backwards here. But what this language requires is for any party that wants to appeal a permit, to get standing. In other words, they've gone to the planning commission meetings, they've voiced their opinion at that point. Because they've been involved since the start, they are allowed to appeal, but they have to prove that they have a particular injury. And that is the defining moment. Representative Mahaley feels that will lead to fewer appeals of municipal permits and get projects going faster.
Because I know over the years, people that want to be part of it, they really cause trouble. And unless they're, as you said, unless they're really being personally impacted, they shouldn't. I don't think they should have a say, but they do. And sometimes they're so loud that they kind of shift the whole project, and that's I don't like that. That's Are you supportive of this, or your association?
So, I think it's a good. I'm not a legal mind, So, but I do believe. I listened to the chair of House General, and he is very confident that it will be the outcome.
I think so.
I think that it'll be well received in the Senate as well. It is about municipal permitting, and not about Act 250 permits and that sort of thing. But it's a great step in the right direction.
That's great. Well, I think you were at absolutely every single meeting. Every time I go on Zoom to find out what was happening, there's Peter.
We were very active last year in the Act 250 bill, which became Act 181, and has really set the stage for so many things.
That's good.
If I may,
please,
shift a little bit. I was at the Vermont Development Conference back in November, and there was a room of 120 or so attorneys, developers, just general folks in that industry. And one of the panelists said, "Hey, is anyone using interim exemptions for housing development?" And like a dozen hands went up in the room. And I think that afterwards, I know Carly Bergen from Vermont Public did an article on it and identified like 12 or 13 projects going on around the state that were taking advantage of the interim exemptions that we put in place with Act 181. Yeah,
because this discussion, I mean, this year it's like repeating history. There's so much stuff that's out there in the legislature like this that's been discussed. And some of this, its time has come, which I'm very glad to hear this, what the changes so far.
We think so. And the interim exemptions last year, you may recall with Act 250, if you hit 10 units within 5 miles within 5 years, the old 10-5-5 rule, you were dragged into Act 250. It allowed in downtowns and village centers and growth centers to boost that number to 50 units at least, maybe 75 units in big downtowns, without having to go through Act 250 permitting. And as a result, these projects are not 9 units. They're 25 units or 33 units, things of that nature. So the ability to put a lot more housing online faster has definitely been encouraged by the interim exemptions passed last year that are already kicking in. this year's housing bills will just, kind of facilitate more residential growth.
Good. Well, people seem to really be listening. I know for the last, couple of years, 3 or 4 years, Natural Resources has been trying to do Act 250, and they couldn't get out of their own way because people are so entrenched into what they think Act 250. Some are afraid to lose the rural nature, and some, it just goes back and forth. So this almost kind of like sets a premise that maybe we can change this.
There is a path forward, and I think that the interim exemptions got that started. What I can tell you is that the regional planning commissions have done a lot of work in the past year, because part of the goal of Act 181 was to figure out where do you want more residential growth.
Right.
We know that downtowns and village centers and the areas around them create walkable communities, the benefits that I think, we're looking for generally. So that really set the stage for further development. And Act 181 has a number of different stops on the way as they try to define, where we want growth, where we want protection, and how we deal with the environment going forward.
Somewhere in the bill, and I think it's S.127, they're talking about carving out sections which are, what's the word? They don't have to deal with Act 250. It's a protected area that if you build in this area, you just build.
Yeah.
Now, what's that? That sounds exciting.
Sure. So, and this actually did start in Act 181 last year, and we've identified basically 3 tiers of Vermont that need to be defined now. Some are really easy to figure out. Tier 1A is a downtown, is a big city that has zoning and planning capabilities. Doesn't need Act 250 to review everything because they're doing a good job by themselves. In the future, they will have to go through, kind of a set of rules and be able to adhere to those rules to be able to have that Tier 1A status. Tier 1B, the easiest way I can describe it, are villages and the areas around villages that need to be, that have maybe not quite as high a capability, but certainly the ability to manage the development in their areas. The Planning Commission is making these maps that will show where the village center is and then where the area for residential development is. Now, if you're inside that area, you're going to get the benefit. If you're outside that area, you become Tier 2. But I want to jump to Tier 3 first, because Tier 3 are environmentally sensitive areas in Vermont. And depending on how you define that could be, different areas, high elevation areas, or it could be most of the state. And this is one of our concerns as we were working on the bill last year. Who's going to be on the committee to kind of define Tier 3? And that, fortunately, the Vermont Association of Realtors have been added to that group. It is just starting its work now, reporting back to the legislature this fall. I am.
Oh, yeah,
yes,
good
indeed.
For you.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep. So I think that's really the critical place. Rulemaking, we pass legislation which kind of sets the guidelines, but the death is in the details, and rulemaking is where that happens. The legislative language around Tier 3 are river corridors, floodplains, things of that nature. And then I think what I more typically think of as higher elevation areas that would be have more. It would have more restrictive, Act 250 oversight. Not to say it couldn't do things there, but it would obviously, you'd have to have much higher threshold.
Is that where like the brownfield areas are? Is that part of this discussion?
Brownfields are typically in municipalities, right? I mean, it's a dry cleaner or somebody that has contaminated the soil. So that's going to be more core. Where I think the real challenge is going to be is, let's say you've got a downtown. It's a Tier 1A area, but right through the middle of basically every town in Vermont is a river. And that's got to be protected. And let's face it, that's not a great place to encourage growth. I think but if we're not going to encourage growth in river corridors, we need more areas outside of the towns that can be encouraged for residential development.
Was that intended to maybe help flooding? And, or
Oh, definitely.
yeah.
Well, help protect against flooding.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think that you're going to continue to see, buildings in river corridors because they're already there. But in terms of encouraging residential development, especially, the planning commissions are looking at areas outside of town that are safe, that are above the floodplain, in areas where residential development can occur. That's Tier 3. That leaves Tier 2, which is the rest of the state. And Tier 2 currently still is subject to the 1055 rule. And that would be most of rural Vermont. And I think that once we define Tier 3 and really get a handle on what that's going to look like, revisiting Tier 2 and the committees even last year, studied Tier 2 and said, we're not really doing a very good job of defining this. But I think once Tier 1s are set, Tier 3 is set, we'll take a look at Tier 2 and try and make it appropriate.
That's great. So when do you have to finish your work? Next legislative session, or?
Yep. That work group, I'm thinking it's January 15th still. I'm actually working with the land, and this is the new Land Use Review Board, the old Natural Resources Board, also on the appeals study, because at the Act 250 level, there is a debate about who should hear appeals. Currently, appeals of Act 250 permits are heard in environmental court.
Right.
There was a lot of testimony last year that the Land Use Review Board should work like the old Natural Resources Board, kind of a quasi judicial board like the Public Utility Commission, and hear appeals on their own. So this appeals study group will be tasked with determining should appeals stay with the environmental court, should they go to the Land Use Review Board.
Right.
And that will be another really interesting
You're gonna have
discussion.
a busy summer, Peter.
Yeah, I think so. Well, and then, and I'm sure that they're aware of this, but both the House bill and the Senate bill have moved up the timetable. That was due to be, I think it was January 15th, and they moved it back to November 15th to report back.
Right.
Mostly because the legislature needs reports before January 1st so they can write bills.
Right.
And, so you see this happening on a lot of things. It'll be original language is January 15th, and they push it back a month or two. Yeah. So we'll see how that all kind of plays out.
This way they're ready to go in January instead of...
Right, the legislature is.
Yeah, the legislature.
I'm not sure that the work groups are going to be ready, but we're going to have to hustle.
Well, it sounds like if you're on it, that they're going to have the right people on this committee that have the background, because we don't get into education so much, but sometimes
I'm only one guy.
I know, but they bring in the same old, and you know what the outcome's going to be.
Right.
So if you bring in people who have perhaps a different set of expertise and can add to the conversation, that's a good thing.
Yep. That will be our objective.
Yeah, very good. Do you have help from your board on your associate? Do they help you cover the legislature?
Sure.
Do they?
Yeah. So the Realtor Association is a voluntary organization. We have a small staff, 4 people. I do all the advocacy work, but I work with a government affairs committee who is at least one member from each of our local boards. And sometimes there's 2 or 3 members, but it is a group of folks that are interested in policy, and we have some really good discussions. They are very tuned into what's going on. We have kind of always had this standard in the Government Affairs Committee that you can say what you want, and we're never going to put you down for that. But let's just get it out there, and especially we do emails, reply all emails that will just the topic will just be so thoroughly vetted that I get great guidance. I'm ready to go. I know where everybody's coming from.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, you came on with Ken Libby. He's one of my favorite folks.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
I've known Ken for 100 years. Well, maybe not 100. Close enough. Anyway, there is something that I am so excited about this because I can't quite... The Universal Design Study Committee. That sounds like one... It's to charge this group to come up with designs that will fit everybody, whether you're old, young, disabled, whatever. What is that all about?
Yeah, so
that sounds great.
That came out of the House General and Housing Committee. Is a passion of Representative Barrows from actually from Brownsville, where I used to live years ago.
There you go.
And I think that having buildings that are universally accessible, think about Americans with Disability Act, that trying to encourage designs that work that way was really the objective. Okay. This is really to define what universal designs are supposed to be, to provide definitions to the topics of that particular study. And once again, the Vermont Association of Realtors named to be part of that work group as well. I actually have somebody else who's interested in doing it. So
well, you have to have a certain maybe construction background or something.
Indeed.
About to understand. So it would be a house that, regardless of who you are and what deals, you can make that fit you.
Exactly.
It's sort of. I was reminded of the Tunnels to Tower ad you see where the disabled vets come into a home and you can lift the countertops up or down.
Right.
Is that sort of what they're thinking about?
Yeah, I think so. And quite honestly, it's an area that I don't have any particular expertise in. That's why I reached out to our members and said, hey, if somebody has information, knowledge here, we'd love to have you participate.
And it's supposed to meet all of the environmental, things that houses should respond to, weather and that sort of stuff. So I think that's really great and presumably affordable, I guess. And in both these bills, accessibility was a word that was repeated a million times because it was about accessibility.
Right.
And they were talking in one of the write-ups of the bill about what impact low housing availability has, for the homeless. I just think of all these young people can't move here because they can't find a place to live.
Right.
Do you have statistics that you use to explain this to people in your association? Somebody said today they have 1,000. There's only 1,000 homes on some lists, that are available, and of course you've got maybe 4,000 requests and not enough homes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is something that has gone on for a decade, probably decades. Right. That we have been so protective of the environment, and I've got to be honest with you. I mean, I think the environmental community is really the reason why Act 181 was able to pass, because they recognized that if we want to protect the environment, environmentally sensitive areas, we need to encourage growth where we want to see it, and that's in downtowns and village centers. Now there is still the person that wants to be out in the country on 10 acres or whatever, and I guess that that development will continue to occur at whatever level. That'll be a Tier 2 area probably, so they'll be under whatever restrictions are for Tier 2. But for the most part, I think that there was this kind of recognition that if we're going to protect environmentally sensitive areas, we really need to figure out where we want housing to occur. VHFA does great reports on housing needs assessments, and that's one of the reports that says we need 30,000 homes by 2050 or whatever, and that's a great objective, but it's so expensive to build right now that I think many builders are not going to those bigger subdivision kind of developments because it's just too risky.
I know some friends that live in Burlington. Every time they talk about the cost, I just it just shudders. I find it. Well, remember Howard Dean used to push. He was always pushing moving downtown, living in the downtown. But people just don't want that. They want a little elbow room. you know.
Yeah, that's
So-
true. But I think, what we're going to do is we're going to say, look, if you want to, to solve this housing crisis, if you want to
Right.
still call it a crisis, somebody told me that it's not really a crisis because we did it to ourselves. So,
It could still be a crisis.
right,
Yeah, for sure.
But if you want to really address it, we know that compact development and, mostly in those downtown village center areas is where we want to
I
see
know
it.
one evening, I shan't tell you what town, but I was visiting there, and they got started. There was a lot of environmental people on the board. It was a select board thing. And we got into a little bit of discussion because I was sticking up for the businessman and for the developers. I said, nobody wants to pave paradise, that song, pave paradise. That's the attraction of Vermont. Is when you're building a plant here, you want to attract people who want to live in this environment. They don't
Sure.
want to ruin it. And they just they wouldn't believe me. And I wish I had had statistics to back me up, but it's more anecdotal. But everybody I talk to in the industry, they want the place to stay the way it is as well for their families.
Sure, yeah.
And they, for some reason, think they're going to come in and destroy it all. And I don't think that's right.
One of the things, one of the analogies that I use is I want to make sure that the general store in a little town survives.
There you go.
And if they don't have anybody living there, if they're not having some residential development occur, how do we keep these little mom and pops going?
Right.
And I came from a small town, and so I've always kind of appreciated, the desire to have that vibrant small town kind of living.
Well, we're even in Berlin because we don't have a downtown.
Right.
And unless you have kids in school, there's very little way for you to get to know your neighbors, which is why I get involved in town.
Yeah.
But because I think everybody always needs a place to congregate.
Exactly.
And,
Exactly. And it has been schools, and the whole education funding reform discussion going on in the legislature right now, it has a lot to do with that. What happens if we close some of these smaller elementary schools,
right.
because they are the center of so many municipalities.
Exactly.
And I think I hope that there will be a thoughtful discussion that ends up, bringing some real progress. Because, from a taxpayer's perspective, the cost of education has become somewhat unaffordable.
Right.
We're fortunate this year. It looks like that property tax increase will average about 1%.
Right.
Better than 13.8%
Well, that's because they're borrowing
from
from
last
Peter
year.
to pay Paul. They've got some money that's
Yeah.
floating around.
Yep. The governor, the governor put some money in from the
Right.
general fund, and
Right.
they pulled some reserve money. And those are one-time dollars, and
Yeah.
that's always a concern that you won't be replacing one-time
Right.
dollars.
Well-
But, we've got to start somewhere.
Yeah, no,
And-
I agree with you, but at one point, it's going to have to pay the piper, as they say, and there isn't going to
Yep.
be any money to move over, so
Right.
it's coming soon. But, and I always find it interesting, though, that they're very excited about local control. I always call it local influence, because by the time you get that bill before you, you don't have a lot to say about the money that goes into education, and people don't get as involved as they should.
Right.
Nobody shows up for the meetings, but that's another show, Peter.
Yep.
That's another story.
But I do think it's pretty clear that the voters spoke in November and said, look, we need you to do something. We want to provide a great education for our kids, but we want to do it in a cost-effective manner.
Do you know, last year the Sergeant-at-Arms office told me they got more phone calls because of the property tax than they did on abortion. It was just people and they changed their minds.
Yeah.
They did listen, and they adjusted it a little bit because people just went crazy. The Sergeant-at-Arms office was just inundated.
Right.
And they were keeping tabs, and they said more than abortion, which was in itself another whole discussion. So we talked a little bit about Brownsfield.
Yes.
I know when I worked part-time for Barry City at one point, they had some, and you mentioned laundromat. That was exactly what happened in Barry City. There was a laundromat. Laundromat.
Yep.
And when you could see the pictures of this balloon underneath the streets of things you don't want there.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
Do we have a lot of those still in Vermont, or are they getting rid of them slowly?
There's a fair amount, I think, still. You know, the challenge is it takes federal funding dollars
Right.
and a lot of dollars to clean up brownfields. But both the House and Senate bills really do address, you know, the need to do that and provide some resources for that to occur.
Yeah.
You know, when you're looking at where you can develop, especially in a village or a city, you know, contaminated sites may be, you know, useful for development
Right.
if they can be cleaned up.
Right.
And you
that's
know, you don't
quite a
want
project.
residential.
You know, I was in charge of organizing the effort, and whoa, when you clean those things up, everybody gets involved. It's really huge.
Right.
Huge. But when you see the pictures of what's underneath your feet, like,
Yeah.
get rid of it now. So I'm looking at all the programs that they funded in the bills, and they all seem to. It seems to be the right thing to do for me. Initially, when I was looking at the wrong bill, before you and I talked, there were so many committees and stuff that
Studies.
I mean, seriously.
Yes, as one legislator told me last year, we're great at studying
Yeah,
things.
right, exactly. And I looked at it and I said, what's that? That's another year, maybe two,
Yep.
and they're never going to get this done. This actually does something.
I think so. Yeah, and it really builds on the stuff we did last year. Really allows for continued growth of the VHIP program, especially. I think has been very productive getting rental housing out there. So we'll see this continue, and at the same time, all the work that Act 181, the Act 250 bill from last year, kind of put into place is going to be carried out over the next 2 or 3 years.
Now, is your committee required to have public hearings, or did they put that on you, or just to meet and do wondrous things?
Well,
I'm sorry, the design committee, 'cause that's fascinating.
oh,
to me.
okay, yeah. So that's really just a report back to the legislature.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I guess you know, if they could pull in any their public meetings.
Yeah.
They'll have to be broadcast.
I'm gonna butt in just to. I'm just curious what they're going to talk about.
Right.
Because that could be a real opportunity.
Sure. Yeah.
To do some good.
Yep, I think so. One of the other studies that actually was going on last year, and now the Senate bill for sure is asking for a land bank study report. And now the first year was a study. The second year will be to bring actual policy back for consideration.
Right.
And we actually introduced the concept of land banks. It was 4 years ago now, and it didn't really get going. Because who is going to manage land banks, things of that nature. And a land bank is designed to take mostly municipally owned properties, through tax default or other kinds of properties that the municipality owns, and resell them to somebody who will use them for a much higher purpose for the municipality. Once again, you're trying to build your grand list values, right? A derelict piece of property that can be rehabbed potentially has the ability to add to the grand list. So I think that land bank report coming back is going to be important for next year's legislative activity.
Well, and I think I pulled out before I came here tonight the Joint Fiscal Office fiscal notes on both these bills. They don't have a number for H.479 because each section has been given a dollar figure, but they didn't add it up. But the S.127, the total from the general fund would be $50.45 million, and then they have it broken down where it would go for. But they also were, and they talked about the TIF being part of the education fund and maybe having an impact on that. And I think, I don't know, I'm excited about this because I think they really covered a lot that you don't think is intertwined, but it is.
It is.
One thing leads to another, and workforce development is huge, and we need housing for people that want to come here and work. And it's, as a matter of fact, I forget her name now, from St. Albans. I'll think of it. 2 in the morning, I'll call you up and say I remembered. But she said when she was on the show, she said that what's interesting is that it's not two people or more looking for, it's single occupants. There are more
Right.
of them, whether graduating from college or something, they're not pairing up or whatever. It's mostly single people wanting an apartment.
The average,
or something.
yeah,
Right.
the average home, units
Right.
in terms of people living there. And you're right. I mean, it is much lower than it has been.
Yeah.
Certainly you have, people where the kids have left the home already, and it's down to 2 adults.
Right.
But many first-time renters and that
Right,
sort of
just
thing are
one person.
one person.
Which
Yeah.
is a whole different, which adds to the number of apartments you need.
Right.
Because before, if they doubled up and stuff,
Yep.
of course, it's so expensive. My grandchildren, they're like, why don't you have a, and he said, Grandma, I'd have to have 4 or 5 people living with me. He said,
Just to
I'm home
afford
with
the
Mom,
rent.
she
Yeah.
gets her food cooked and the laundry done, and she goes like,
Not a bad deal.
I said, oh, I understand, because otherwise they'd have to have a whole bunch of friends living all together to afford these things. It's crazy.
Right. Yeah, so are we right-sizing, and we have one of the oldest housing stock in the country, just being New England.
Right.
A lot of those are beautiful, magnificent Victorian,
Right.
3-story,
Yep.
that are not very energy efficient to begin with, and then, then really don't fit that 1 or 2 person, kind of how.
But there is funding
household.
available if you want to make it into smaller units.
Sure.
There is, through Commerce and Community Development, I think there's money that if you want to.
And that is that
Yeah.
VHIP program,
Yeah.
very likely. Yeah, I know of one developer down in Bennington who has been doing this pretty regularly, taking a Victorian single-family home, turning it into a 2 or 3 unit rental property.
Deal.
And the interesting thing, because you always talk about, rental affordability, does it need to be subsidized? And he said, look, I try to set my rents as reasonable as I can so that people can pay them.
Right.
Because the worst thing any landlord can have is a tenant not paying the
Right,
rent.
for sure.
And so, I think he took a very practical approach.
That's great, good for
to
him.
accomplishing that.
And what's nice about those old homes, they're all unique, and they make your home feel special with perhaps a little different bend on the roofing and just different kind of windows and stuff.
Sure. I passed a few as I came up here today.
Did you?
Yeah.
Well, my house, I don't know what they call it, but when you open the front door, there's a stairway upstairs.
Yep.
And we put a sliding door between that and the living room. And because we were thinking of changing the upstairs. And if we could knock out the wall over the garage,
Yeah.
it would be huge. And so if we ever wanted to do that in our older years, which are now,
Yeah.
we could have some income.
Well, and that VHIP, so that is typically called an accessory dwelling unit,
Okay,
right?
right.
And VHIP actually does also provide funding for accessory dwelling
Yeah,
units.
that's
So, you may have a
Accessory dwelling.
ADU.
There you go.
Accessory dwelling
Oh,
unit.
yeah, I saw
So,
that.
and that's up to 900 square feet. It used to be 30% of the home, whatever
Yep.
the home size was, but then they changed that to 900 square feet, which is a pretty, that's a pretty comfortable apartment, especially if you're 1 or 2 people.
Yeah, right, exactly. This is
It fits.
great.
It fits the need.
Yeah, it's good. And as you get older, what you thought you would have for retirement sometimes isn't quite as much as
Right.
as you had envisioned, and that might help a little. But anyway, Peter, we have run out of time, I think.
Oh, no kidding.
Have
Okay.
we? A little bit more. Is there anything you'd like to tell people before we head on out and just keep track of this?
Yeah, I really feel like the continuation of last year's work on Act 250, and actually even the year before, where a lot of zoning regulations from municipalities were kind of changed.
Right.
The interim exemptions are leading to some housing immediately. The planners have done a great job of trying to identify areas for growth around villages and downtowns. Their work should be done this year, probably. And then it's going to be up to villages and downtowns to qualify through the Act 250 process for Tier 1A or Tier 1B. And we'll continue to have these discussions about environmentally sensitive areas. What does that tier 2 look like, which I really think has not been well defined so far, and that'll be something we'll be advocating for sure.
I just realized that they gave permission to tack on a 1% tax on renters. What was that for?
That did not come through the Ways and Means Committee in the House. It was a 1%. It would have allowed a local municipality to have a 1% tax added to, and it was only short-term rentals.
Oh, really?
That was really
like a B&B or something?
No, short-term, Airbnb or VRBO. Short-term rentals are always a kind of a question, I guess. Are they taking away from residential housing or not? That's the big concern.
So it's more of a discouragement than
yeah, but the tax department actually testified that it would be virtually impossible to administer on a town-by-town basis.
So it's not going to make it into
that was kind of shelved.
I didn't like that. I thought, because we just implemented in Berlin the 1% local option.
Option tax for sales tax, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And
same kind of concept. So I think that what we're finding is that short-term rentals really associated around the resorts, they're not going to take a ton of residential housing away. How do you protect residential housing from that? That's a challenge because where does it occur? But overall, they add a tremendous amount of revenue to the state in terms of taxes already. Right. I mean, they already got taxed 3% higher than the rooms tax last year. So I think this is only fair to give them a break this year.
Did they discuss? There's nothing in here about parking per unit. Is there any?
So that was a lot of the zoning stuff from a couple of years ago, and it did allow for one parking space per unit, and as a minimum. And I think actually last year's Act 250 bill, come to think of it, had parallel parking in certain projects.
I remember the discussion last year, because if you take these big homes and make 2 or 3 smaller apartments in it,
you may not have the parking spaces.
Where do you
exactly.
Go?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a challenge, but I think it's at the right balance. One per unit, and kind of have the builder figure that out.
So now we should just watch what happens to these bills. They're going to cross over, or
they have crossed over.
They have crossed over.
Yep. So they're starting to review them right now.
Right.
My personal feeling is we're going to end up with one bill that both committees agree on. Probably won't even need a committee, a conference. At the end.
That would be great.
Yeah, I think and even if they do that, it's just going to be to hammer out some details.
Right.
So, we'll continue to fund VHIP. We'll provide funds for mobile home development and improvements. The bond stuff and the TIF project, the CHIP, which is a tax incremental financing. If those components stay in, I think they're going to be excellent to help development.
That's great, because each one, like we talked about, has got a little bit of uniqueness, and they can just kind of put it into one and agree on everything. They've got to do something this year. They're so close.
It's happening. It's happening. We may not be seeing it, but it is happening, and I think that we're headed in the right direction.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? Finally, we're here.
I think so.
I think people are listening.
Yep.
Oh, that's good. Peter, thank you very much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
We'll have you back as this continues. Of course, they're almost done. They've got to move it quickly.
Well, yeah, we're halfway through. I mean, I personally think the whole budget discussion is going to take some time, and certainly this education finance reform is huge, and there's no simple answer. So both the House Education Committee and the Senate Education Committee are just working away at it.
You've got the governor's proposal. You have our Campaign for Vermont's proposal, which of course I'm supporting.
Sure.
Because I think the governor having 5 superintendencies is just too big for Vermont. And we've got, we propose 14 to be, each one to be surrounded by or have the tech center, and then have a supervisory unit around the tech center, so that there'd be a better working relationship between the tech center and
we're pleased. I mean, I think that a lot of kids are taking advantage of tech centers now.
Thank God they've lost that. When I was growing up, it was, you're going to the tech center. That's where you sent the kids who couldn't make it. But most of our construction people, they want kids that can do stuff with their hands and understand the mechanics of it, and
Right.
and you're always going to need plumbing, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and they start out with big salaries.
They're okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and then you come out of the tech center hired by a contractor,
Right,
and
you're set.
and you don't have any college debt, you know, so you can go forward.
Yeah, and you get out 2 years sooner and at half the cost. I mean, it's
Right.
quite a deal. It's quite a deal. Anyway,
Yeah.
thank you very
Good.
much, Peter.
All
I
right,
appreciate
Pat.
you coming.
Nice to see you
We'll
as
see
always.
you soon. Thank
yeah,
you.
thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me in.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in. I know you enjoyed this, so just share it with your friends. That'd be really great. This is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. See you next week.